Ambassador had spent 30 years building her reputation. In all the galaxy, no one was more patient than her. No one was better at finding peace between angry species. When the Ani threatened to destroy 3 star systems over a trade insult, had talked them down in 6 hours. When they refused to speak to any warm-blooded species for a decade, had been the one to break the silence. Humanity was new to the galactic stage. They had only been part of the Council for 80 years. In a galaxy where some species counted their history in hundreds of thousands of years, humans were practically children. And like children, they had learned to be quiet, to watch, to listen, to make themselves useful in small ways until the older species forgot to see them as a threat. Had been the perfect example of this strategy. She smiled when ambassadors insulted her. She nodded when council members dismissed human opinions. She waded through endless debates that went nowhere. She had become so good at patience that some species used the word human as a synonym for harmless. This was exactly what humanity wanted them to think. The emergency summons came on a Tuesday, though such Earth words meant nothing in the vast darkness of space. Was on her private ship, traveling between diplomatic meetings, when her communication system lit up with priority alerts. The Galactic Council was calling an emergency session. Her presence was required immediately. Changed course for Nexus Prime, the great station at the heart of Council space. It was a massive structure, built over thousands of years by dozens of species. Millions of beings lived and worked there. It was the closest thing the galaxy had to a capital city. As her ship made the 3-day journey, reviewed what little information she had. There had been reports from the outer verge, the distant edges of known space where new species were still finding their way to the stars. Something had happened there. Something bad enough to trigger emergency protocols that hadn't been used in 400 years. When arrived at Nexus Prime, she found a data package waiting in her quarters. It was marked with the highest security classification. It had been sent by sources she trusted completely, sources that had taken decades to cultivate. She opened the files and began to read. The first report was from a world called IV. It was home to a species that had achieved space flight only 50 years ago. They were small, gentle beings who communicated through color changes in their skin. They had been excited to join the galactic community. They had sent messages of friendship to every species they could contact. Those messages had stopped 8 months ago. Watched the reconnaissance footage. IV was burning. Great ships hung in orbit, ships bearing the mark of the dominion of. They were one of the oldest species in the galaxy. They had been founding members of the Council. They were respected, feared, and incredibly wealthy. They were also, according to these files, systematically destroying entire civilizations. The second report was from Threshold, a colony world settled by They were traders, peaceful and clever. They had done nothing to offend anyone, but their world sat on the edge of territory they wanted to control, so they had taken it. The footage showed civilians being loaded onto transport ships. None of them were ever seen again. There were 13 reports in total, 13 worlds, 13 species. Some had been wiped out completely. Others had been captured, taken to places the intelligence services could only guess at. The evidence pointed to labor camps, experimentation facilities, processing centers where living beings were treated like raw materials. Read every word. She watched every recording. She saw children crying for parents who would never come. She saw elders trying to protect their families with nothing but their bodies. She saw entire cultures erased in fire and silence. And then she found the worst part. The Council had known. Not every member, not every species, but enough of them. The Ani had received reports and classified them as internal matters. They had calculated the economic impact of intervention and decided it was too costly. They had debated the philosophical implications for so long that 2 more worlds had fallen while they discussed definitions of aggression. controlled the Nexus trade corridors, the shipping lanes that made galactic commerce possible. Confronting them would mean economic chaos. It would mean war. It would mean risking everything the Council had built over. So they had looked away. They had signed treaties promising not to interfere. They had accepted bribes and gifts and favorable trade terms. They had decided, without ever saying it out loud, that some lives were worth less than others. Sat in her quarters for 6 hours after finishing the files. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She did not move. Anyone watching would have thought she was meditating, or perhaps that she had simply shut down like an overloaded computer. But inside her mind, 30 years of patience was burning away. She thought about the young human officers who asked her why they had to be so careful around other species. She thought about the colonies on the edge of human space, unprotected and vulnerable. She thought about her granddaughter, just 3 years old, who loved looking at pictures of alien worlds and dreaming of visiting them someday. She thought about a little girl whose name she would later learn was a girl who had liked drawing pictures of ships, a girl who had wanted to be an explorer, a girl who had died screaming while the galaxy's greatest powers counted their money and looked the other way. When finally moved, it was to send a single message back to Earth. The message contained only 2 words: activate Prometheus. On Earth, in a room buried deep beneath the Andes Mountains, a screen lit up with those words. 3 people read them. They looked at each other. They nodded. And then they began to wake up a military machine that had been sleeping for 60 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Back on Nexus Prime, Ambassador showered, changed into her most formal clothes, and sent a request to address the full Galactic Council. She invoked Emergency Protocol 7, a rule that allowed any ambassador to demand an immediate hearing on matters of existential importance. The last time anyone had used that protocol, it had been to announce an invasion by extragalactic entities. Was about to announce something far more dangerous. She was going to tell the truth. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was built to make visitors feel small. It rose 12 levels high, each level filled with seats for a different founding species. Thousands of delegates sat in those seats, representing hundreds of worlds and trillions of beings. Light filtered down from a ceiling made of transparent crystal, showing the stars themselves as a reminder of what the Council protected. Walked into this chamber alone. She wore a simple black suit with no decorations. Her silver hair was pulled back from her face. She carried no notes, no visual aids. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a minor ambassador from a young species coming to ask the powerful for help. The delegates watched her with mild curiosity. The human ambassador was known for her patience, her soft voice, her endless willingness to compromise. Whatever had made her invoke Emergency Protocol 7 must be serious, but surely it would be handled quietly. Surely she would ask nicely for whatever she wanted and accept whatever scraps the Council offered. High Ran of the Ani called the session to order. He was a massive being, nearly 3 meters tall, covered in scales that shifted color with his mood. Right now they were a bored gray. He had been leading the Council for 200 years and had seen countless crises come and go. This human woman did not worry him. "Ambassador," he said, his voice booming through translation devices around the chamber. "You have invoked Emergency Protocol 7. This protocol has not been used in 400 cycles. The Council expects a clear explanation." Stood at the center of the chamber, a tiny figure surrounded by giants. She looked up at the tiers of delegates. She took her time, letting her gaze travel across crystals and bulk and the sleek armor of the delegation sitting in their honored seats. "I have a question for this council," she said. Her voice was soft, but the acoustics of the chamber carried it perfectly. Every being heard her as clearly as if she stood beside them. "When the of IV sent distress signals, did any of you answer?" The chamber went quiet. The bored expressions began to change. When the colonists on threshold begged for help, did any of you respond? Now there was movement, delegates shifting in their seats, whispered conversations starting and stopping. The delegation sat perfectly still. When the children of 13 worlds cried out for someone to save them, did any of you even listen? High Rand's scales had turned an angry red. Ambassador, these accusations are inappropriate. The matters you reference are classified under Council Security Directive. I know exactly what they are classified under. His voice did not rise, but something in it had changed. The softness was still there, but now it was the softness of a blade sliding from its sheath. I also know who signed those classification orders. I know who received payments to keep silent. I know who traded the lives of millions for favorable shipping rates. She raised her hand, and holographic files began to appear around her. Hundreds of them, thousands, documents and recordings and financial transfers, all floating in the air like a storm of evidence. I have transmitted these files to every delegation in this chamber, every bribe, every agreement, every name. The chamber exploded. Delegates leaped to their feet, shouting in a dozen languages. Some were screaming denials. Others were screaming accusations at their neighbors. The ambassador rose from his seat with cold dignity and walked toward the exit, his guards falling in around him. Stood motionless at the center of it all, watching the chaos she had created. It took the security forces 9 minutes to restore order. By the time silence returned, the delegation was gone. Half the chamber was reading the files on their personal devices with expressions of horror or fury. The other half was staring at like she had grown a second head. High Rand was no longer bored. His scales had gone pure white, a color that meant barely controlled rage in his species. His voice shook when he spoke. Ambassador, you have violated 17 protocols of diplomatic conduct. You have compromised classified intelligence. You have endangered the security of this council and every species it represents. You have. I have done what none of you had the courage to do. His interruption cut through his words like a knife. In 30 years of diplomacy, she had never interrupted anyone. The shock of it silenced even the high. I have told the truth, she continued. Not a comfortable truth, not a convenient truth, but the truth nonetheless. She turned slowly, speaking to the entire chamber now. Humanity came to the stars expecting wonders. We found them. We found species that live for thousands of years. We found technology that seemed like magic. We found civilizations that had been building and growing while we were still learning to make fire. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. It made her words hit harder. We also found this council. We thought it was a beacon of civilization, a gathering of the wise and the powerful working together to protect all life in the galaxy. She shook her head. We were wrong. This council is not a government. It is not a protector. It is a business arrangement. And the cost of doing business has been paid in the blood of those too weak to fight back. The ambassador raised a crystalline limb. They were known for their cold logic, their emotional distance. They calculated everything in terms of costs and benefits. What would you have us do, ambassador? War with the Dominion would destabilize the entire sector. The economic damage alone would take centuries to repair. Millions would die in the fighting. Turn to face the directly. Millions are already dying, she said. Every day that you debate, every hour that you calculate costs and benefits, every minute that you weigh their lives against your comfort, more of them die. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to almost a whisper. I used to believe patience was a virtue. I used to believe that if we waited long enough, if we were reasonable enough, if we played by your rules long enough, things would change. She shook her head. I was a fool. Nothing will change until someone forces it to change. Nothing will get better until someone makes it better. She looked up at the chamber one final time. meeting the eyes of every species that had sat in comfort while worlds burned. Humanity has made a decision. We are done asking permission. We are done waiting for consensus. We are done being patient. Drew a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her soft voice filled the entire chamber with words that would echo through history. It is time for war. The silence after this declaration lasted exactly 4 heartbeats. Then the grand chamber erupted into the worst chaos it had seen in 1,000 years. Delegates were not just shouting now. They were moving, leaving their seats, clustering into groups. Some were running for the exits. Others were pushing toward the center, toward their intentions unclear. Security forces rushed in, trying to create order from madness. Did not move. She stood at the center of the storm like a statue, watching everything she had built in 30 years fall apart around her. Her reputation as a peacemaker was gone. Her relationships with other species were gone. Her career was gone. She did not care. Some things were more important than careers. Hiran was pounding his speaking platform, demanding order. His scales were cycling through colors so fast they almost seemed to glow. It took the security forces another 12 minutes to clear the aisles and force delegates back to their seats. Even then, the chamber hummed with whispered conversations and angry gestures. "Ambassador," the High said when something like quiet had been restored. His voice was cold and hard now, all pretense of diplomatic courtesy abandoned. "You must understand that this council cannot support your declaration. Even if your evidence is genuine, even if everything you claim is true, we cannot simply declare war on one of our founding members." "I did not ask for your support." His voice remained soft, calm, almost kind. It made her words more terrifying. "I informed you of humanity's decision. There is a difference." A ripple of shock moved through the chamber. No species had ever spoken to the council this way. No one simply announced they were going to war without seeking approval, without building coalitions, without following the endless protocols that governed everything. The ambassador raised his massive frame from his reinforced seat. They were the largest species in the council, peaceful giants who had not fought a war in over 1,000 years. They were philosophers, thinkers, believers in nonviolence above all else. "Ambassador," he said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder, "we understand your anger. We share your horror at what has been done. But war is not the answer. War is never the answer. Through dialogue, through patience, through understanding, we can find a better way." Turned to face him. For a moment, something like sympathy crossed her face. "Ambassador, I have great respect for your species and your beliefs, but I must ask you a question." She paused. "If a predator was eating your children, would you try to understand it? Would you seek dialogue with it? Or would you stop it?" The did not answer. Reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device. It was a holographic projector, simple technology that any species could buy in any market. She activated it, and an image appeared in the center of the chamber. It was a child, small, pale blue skin, large, dark eyes. She was clearly not human, but something about her was universal. The fear on her face, the tears on her cheeks, the way she reached toward the camera, toward anyone who might help. "Her name was," said softly. "She was 7 years old. She liked drawing pictures of ships. She told her parents she wanted to be an explorer when she grew up. She wanted to see the whole galaxy." The chamber was silent now. Even the angry delegates had stopped their whispered conversations. "Lived on a world called IV. It was a beautiful world, covered in purple forests and silver seas. Her species, had just discovered space flight. They were so excited to meet other beings. They sent messages of friendship to everyone they could reach." His voice was steady, but something in it was beginning to crack. 3 months ago, the Dominion of arrived at IV. They did not respond to the messages of friendship. They did not negotiate or make demands. They simply began their harvest. The image flickered and new images appeared around her. Ships in orbit, cities burning, people running, hiding, dying. The sent distress signals. They begged for help. They asked if anyone was listening, looked up at the chamber. This council received those signals. They were classified under Security Directive 7 and filed away. No response was ever sent. She turned back to the image of. Mother hid her in a basement when the soldiers came. She recorded this message, hoping someone would find it, hoping someone would care. His voice was barely above a whisper now. The soldiers found them both 6 hours later. There were no survivors on IV. An entire species wiped out in a single week, and this council did nothing. The image flickered and died. Stood in the silence that followed, her head bowed. When she looked up again, her eyes were wet, but her voice was iron. I have spent 30 years being patient. I have smiled while your delegates insulted my species. I have nodded while you dismissed our opinions. I have waited while you debated and calculated and measured the value of lives in trade credits. She walked forward toward the highest platform, and no one tried to stop her. I am done waiting. I am done smiling. I am done pretending that patience and diplomacy will solve problems that require action. She stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at Ran. You are afraid of war. I understand. War is terrible. War is costly. War destroys everything it touches. She turned to face the entire chamber one more time. But there is something worse than war. There is standing by while innocents die. There is counting your money while children scream. There is calling yourself civilized while you pay for your civilization in the blood of those you consider beneath you. Her voice rose now, filling the chamber with a power it had never held before. Humanity will fight this war with or without you. We will pay the price because someone must pay it. We will be the ones who say enough because no one else will. She drew a breath. But I am here today to give you a choice. You can stand with us and be remembered as the generation that finally did what was right. Or you can stand aside and be remembered as the cowards who watched while the youngest species in the galaxy fought alone for the soul of civilization itself. She let the words hang in the air. Choose. The chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, the ambassador rose from his seat again. His great frame cast a shadow across dozens of delegates. His voice, when he spoke, shook with emotion his species rarely showed. I have preached nonviolence for 300 years. I have taught that war solves nothing, that peace is always the better path. He paused, and something ancient and terrible moved behind his eyes. But I have also taught that there are times when failing to act is the greatest violence of all. He stepped forward, away from his delegation, and his voice rang out through the chamber. The stand with humanity. The shock that followed those words was greater than anything that had come before. And then, like a dam breaking, other voices began to rise. The stand with humanity. The us stand with humanity. The stand with humanity. One by one, species that had never agreed on anything began to stand together. The coalition that would change the galaxy was being born, and at its center stood a single human woman who had finally run out of patience. Hyran watched his carefully controlled council fall apart. Species that had argued for centuries were suddenly united. Delegates who had never spoken a kind word to each other were shaking hands and making promises. The political order he had maintained for 200 years was crumbling before his eyes. And at the center of it all stood, quiet and calm, as if she had expected this exact outcome. When the initial wave of declarations had passed, when 12 species had announced their support for humanity's war, Ran raised his hand for silence. His scales had settled into a dark purple color that indicated deep thought and concern. Ambassador, he said, his voice carefully controlled now, I acknowledge that you have achieved something remarkable here today. You have built a coalition faster than any in council history, but I must speak plainly. He leaned forward on his platform, his large eyes fixed on. Even with these allies, you cannot win. The Dominion of has the largest fleet in known space. Their ships are more advanced than anything your coalition can field. Their defenses have been built over. They have weapons that can crack planets open like eggs. He spread his hands in a gesture that might have been sympathy or might have been mockery. You are proposing to attack an enemy that cannot be defeated. Your courage is admirable. Your cause may even be just. But you are leading these species to destruction. In 6 months, there will be no coalition. There will be no human territories. There will only be the more powerful than ever and the memory of those foolish enough to challenge them. The chamber was quiet again. The delegates who had just declared their support shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The High's words were harsh, but they were also true. Everyone knew the military power of the. Everyone knew what happened to those who opposed them. Listened to all of this with her head slightly tilted, like a teacher listening to a student make an interesting but incorrect argument. When Rand finished, she smiled. It was not the gentle, patient smile she had worn for 30 years. It was something else entirely. Something that made several delegates move back in their seats without knowing why. "Hi," she said, "may I share something with the council?" Rand gestured permission, though his eyes had narrowed with suspicion. Raised her hand and new holograms appeared around her. These were not documents or recordings. They were schematics, fleet deployments, base locations, logistics chains, military intelligence of a scope and detail that made several admirals in the chamber gasp. "For 80 years," said, "humanity has been part of this council. We have been called young. We have been called naive. We have been called harmless." She gestured at the floating data. "We have also been very, very busy." The schematics showed shipyards hidden in asteroid belts, training facilities built into the hearts of dead moons, supply depots scattered across 100 systems, all disguised as mining operations or research stations. When humanity reached the stars, we found a galaxy that treated new species as prey. We saw what happened to those who were weak. We learned from your example. His voice was soft, but it carried an edge of steel. We decided we would not be weak. She highlighted a section of the holographic display. It showed fleet numbers, ship classes, weapon systems. The delegates who understood military matters went very quiet. "We did not build a trade fleet," continued. "We built an armada. We did not establish colonies. We established forward operating bases. We did not develop luxury goods and entertainment technology. We developed weapons that your intelligence services have never detected because they were designed specifically to avoid detection." She turned to face Rand directly. "For 60 years, we have been planning for the day when we would need to fight. Not because we wanted war, but because we knew that someday someone would force us into one. We hoped it would never come. We prepared as if it would come tomorrow." The high scales had gone pale, almost white. "This is impossible. Our intelligence services monitor all new species. We would have seen." "You saw what we wanted you to see." The smile widened slightly. "Smiling diplomats, patient negotiators, a young species trying so hard to fit in." She shook her head. "We sent our best actors to play those roles. The real work happened in places you never thought to look." She highlighted another section of the display. This one showed communication intercepts, command codes, security protocols. "We also did not spend 30 years learning your customs just to be polite. We learned your systems, your weaknesses, your blind spots." She paused. "We know the defense network has a weakness in Sector 7, where 3 monitoring stations share a single power relay. We know their flagship fleet refuels at Aura Station every 40 cycles. We know their command structure depends on a chain of communication that can be disrupted at 7 specific points." The chamber was completely silent now. The delegates had left, but everyone knew that recordings of this session would reach them within hours. It did not seem to matter to. "Hi, you asked how we plan to win this war. The answer is simple. We have been studying them for 6 decades. We know them better than they know themselves. And we have built a military specifically designed to defeat them." She lowered her hand, and the holograms faded. "The only thing we were missing was allies. Not because we need your ships, though we welcome them. Not because we need your soldiers, though they will be honored." She looked around at the delegates who had pledged their support. "We needed you because this war is not just about defeating it is about building something new, something better, a galaxy where the strong protect the weak instead of feeding on them." The ambassador spoke up, his voice filled with wonder. "You planned all of this, from the very beginning." Nodded. "My government began preparing for this moment before I was born. My grandmother was one of the first planners. My mother helped design the shipyards. I was raised to be exactly what I appeared to be, a patient, harmless diplomat who would be in the right place at the right time." She turned back to Ran. "We did not want this war, High. We spent 60 years hoping we would never need to fight it. But when we discovered what they were doing, when we saw that this council knew and did nothing, we understood that hope was not enough." Her voice hardened. "Sometimes, to protect the innocent, good people must be willing to fight. We are willing." The High sat back in his chair. For the first time in 2 centuries, he looked uncertain. The young species he had dismissed as children had revealed themselves to be something else entirely, something dangerous, something that had been hiding in plain sight all along. "What happens now?" he asked finally. Straightened her shoulders. "Now we go to war. Our fleets will launch in 72 hours. The coalition forces will coordinate with our command structure. We have already identified our first targets." She turned to address the entire chamber one final time. "To those who have joined us, thank you. Your courage will be remembered. To those who have not, I understand. This is not your fight, and we do not ask you to make it yours." She paused. "But I ask you to remember this day. Remember that when the galaxy needed heroes, some species stepped forward. Remember who they were. And remember that humanity, the young species, the children of Earth, stood at the front." She bowed slightly to the chamber. "The next time we speak, it will be to announce victory, or it will be never. Either way, the galaxy will never be the same." She walked out of the chamber without looking back, and behind her, the universe began to change. The war began not with a single massive battle, but with 100 small strikes happening all at once. Human ships appeared in systems where no jump points had been mapped. They came through routes that they had believed were impossible to navigate. They arrived without warning, struck their targets, and vanished before reinforcements could respond. The first targets were not fleets or fortresses. They were communication relays, power stations, supply depots, the invisible infrastructure that allowed the war machine to function. Within the first 6 hours, the Dominion found itself fighting blind and deaf, unable to coordinate its forces across the vast distances of space. Ambassador watched the opening moves from a command center on Nexus Prime. She was no longer wearing her diplomatic blacks. She wore the uniform of a human military advisor, a rank she had secretly held for 30 years. Around her, officers from a dozen species worked together, coordinating the largest military operation the galaxy had ever seen. They had expected a frontal assault. They had positioned their massive fleets at obvious, ready to crush any force that tried to challenge them directly. But the human attack never came to those places. Instead, it flowed around them like water, striking where defenses were weakest. "They are trying to reposition their third fleet," reported a tactical officer, "moving to defend Aura Station." Nodded. "Let them move. Our forces at Aura are a distraction. The real strike is happening at the processing centers in Sector 9. The processing centers, the places where captured populations were taken, where living beings were turned into resources. Human special forces had been preparing for this mission for decades. They knew the layout of every facility. They knew the guard rotations. They knew exactly where the prisoners were held. The liberation of Sector 9 took 4 hours. 40,000 prisoners were freed, members of species that the galaxy had believed were extinct. They emerged from their cells weak and terrified, unable to believe that rescue had finally come. Videos of the liberation spread across the galactic networks faster than any official communication. Species that had refused to join the coalition watched footage of human soldiers carrying alien children to safety. They saw medics treating wounds that had been ignored for years. They saw the conditions inside the processing centers, the evidence of horrors that could no longer be. More species joined the coalition, then more, then more. The command structure tried to adapt, but they were fighting an enemy that knew them too well. Every time they developed a new strategy, the coalition was already prepared for it. Every time they tried to concentrate their forces, those forces found themselves cut off from supplies and support. On the 18th day of the war, the coalition fleet finally met the main force in direct battle. It happened at Aura, the Dominion's oldest colony, a world that had been the seat of their power for 10,000 years. The battle lasted 17 minutes. It was not that they were weak. Their ships were powerful, their crews were skilled, and they fought with the desperation of those who knew they were facing extinction. But they were fighting an enemy that had spent 60 years preparing for exactly this moment. Every tactic had been studied. Every weapon had been analyzed. Every weakness had been and prepared for. Human ships moved through the formation like dancers, their movements coordinated by artificial intelligences that had been trained on 1,000,000 simulated battles. Coalition vessels provided support, their crews following plans that had been developed years before the war began. The fleet, the most feared military force in the galaxy, shattered like glass. Watched the battle's conclusion from the same command center where she had watched it begin. Around her, officers were cheering, embracing, crying with relief. The war was not over, not yet, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Dominion was broken. A communication request appeared on her screen. She accepted it and found herself facing High Ran. He looked older than he had 18 days ago. His scales had lost their luster and his eyes were tired. "Ambassador," he said, "I believe congratulations are in order." Shook her head. "There will be time for congratulations when the last prisoner is freed. We are not done yet." Rand nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology. I dismissed your species as children. I believed you were too young, too weak to matter. I was wrong." "You were not alone in that belief," said. "We worked very hard to create it." A ghost of a smile crossed the High's face. "I suppose you did, but I have to ask, Ambassador, what happens now? The will be defeated, yes. But what comes after? Will humanity use this victory to become what they were? Will you take their place as the galaxy's new masters?" It was a fair question. History was full of liberators who became tyrants, species that fought for freedom and then it to others. Was quiet for a moment before answering. 60 years ago, when humanity began planning for this war, we also began planning for its end. We knew that victory would be meaningless if we simply replaced one tyranny with another. She stood. After they are defeated, there will be trials. Fair trials, conducted by a court representing all species. Those who committed crimes will face justice. Those who simply followed orders will have the chance to build new lives. She paused. And there will be a new council. Not like the old one, where some species had voices and others did not. A true council, where every being has representation, where the weak are protected instead of exploited, where what happened to IV can never happen again. Rand studied her face. "You truly believe this is possible?" "I believe we must try. That is what humanity learned from the stars, High. Not that the galaxy is cruel, though it often is. Not that power matters more than justice, though many believe it. We learned that change is possible, that things do not have to stay as they are, that good people working together can build something better." The war lasted another 47 days. The Dominion surrendered when there was surrounded, choosing survival over extinction. The trials that followed took years, uncovering crimes that had been hidden for centuries. Some faced harsh punishments. Others were shown mercy. The new council debated every case, learning to work together in ways they never had before. Retired 3 years after the war ended, she had spent her whole life preparing for a moment that had come and gone in less than 2 months. Now, at last, she could rest. She settled on a small colony in the outer verge, on a world not far from where IV had once existed. She built a school there, teaching children from a dozen species about diplomacy, about patience, about the difference between waiting and preparing. When visitors came, as they often did, they would ask her about the war. They would ask how it felt to change the course of history. They would ask if she had known from the beginning that humanity would win. She always gave the same answer. "I did not know we would win," she would say. "I only knew that we had to try. That is all any of us can ever do. Try to make things better. Try to protect those who need protecting. Try to build a future worth living in." She would smile then, the same gentle smile she had worn in the council chambers for 30 years. The galaxy is a strange place. It rewards the prepared, but it also rewards the brave. Humanity learned to be both, and in the end, we discovered that we were never really alone. We just had to be willing to stand up first and trust that others would stand with us. Years passed. The new council grew stronger. Species that had been enemies learned to be neighbors. The horror of the Dominion faded into history, remembered but no longer feared. And whenever new species reached the stars, whenever they asked why humanity held such influence, why humans were so respected throughout the galaxy, the answer was always the same. Because when everyone else looked away, they looked closer. Because when everyone else stayed silent, they spoke. Because when the galaxy needed someone to stand against the darkness, a single human woman walked into the most powerful chamber in known space and said the words that changed everything. "It is time for war. Not for conquest, not for power, not for glory. For justice." And the galaxy had never been the same since.